Hello, everybody, and welcome to this podcast. I'm Sue Wareham from the Medical Association for Prevention of War, and I'd like to welcome you. We're calling this podcast Healthcare Australia and the War on Gaza, but we'll be covering a range of aspects of that. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. Myself, I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, but all of us around the country are on unceded lands. And we pay our respects to traditional owners, elders, past, present, and emerging. An extremely warm welcome to our special guest today, Helen McHugh, whom I'll introduce in a moment. We all know how dire and unconscionable the situation in Gaza is. It's evolved as the world watches. And the most recent authoritative report, which has come out from just several days ago, 29th of March, from the European Union, the World Bank and the United Nations, called Gaza Strip and Interim Damage Assessment. And if you want to find that, it was linked from the Croce Health website last night. The report summarised in part that loss of life, forced displacement and damages to social, physical and productive infrastructure are at an unprecedented speed and scale, and that the ongoing conflict has unleashed unprecedented devastation, causing severe social and mental health consequences for women, youth, and vulnerable populations. That's the end of that quote. That word unprecedented crops up repeatedly in relation to the assaults on Gaza. We should note also that the current situation is much worse than just what's happening in Gaza, horrific though that is. And the report I've just cited doesn't refer at all to what's happening in the West Bank, which is an additional crisis and catastrophe in itself. This discussion is partly about the obligations of warring parties in any war zone to protect health workers and facilities, and our starting point is the right to health and healthcare as a fundamental human right, which is written into multiple international law instruments. But in addition to that, we want to put the war since October 7 into a broader context and talk also about the role of Australia, our media, and all of us. So to help us do that, I'm now going to introduce Dr. Helen McHugh, AM, who is known to many of you. Helen has been a forthright and powerful advocate for the Palestinian people. Most recently, she was awarded the 2023-24 Jerusalem Peace Prize, which was awarded on the 23rd of February by Australians for Palestine and the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network for Helen's over 4 decades of passionate advocacy and support for Palestine. And you can read Helen's acceptance speech for that prize on the Pulse of Irritations website. Just a wee bit more about Helen. In the early 1980s, Helen was a young nurse consultant educator for the World Health Organization in the Middle East. She was seconded to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, to work in Lebanon, where she witnessed the horror of the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, after which she decided to work as a volunteer in refugee camps alongside Palestinian nurse Olfat Mahmoud, with whom Helen has remained in close and very warm contact. Helen's been inspired by Dr. Mahmoud, and Dr. Mahmoud very sadly died last September. Realising, this is back to the 1980s, that support for the Palestinians needed to spread globally, Helen returned to Australia specifically to inspire the ACTU to found Union Aid Abroad, AFIDA, whose vision is for the Australian Union movement to express their solidarity in the lives of workers globally. And they've had multiple projects to that end. And over the years, Helen has continued to work in solidarity and partnership with Dr. Mahmoud and others to support projects with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And Helen has supported Dr. Mahmoud to travel to Australia many times and also has taken many Australians, including former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, to see for themselves the reality of life for Palestinians. Helen has done a PhD on gender and Islam, which was inspired by the strength and independence of Palestinian women. Helen has worked more broadly too. She co-founded Rural Australians for Refugees, after the demonisation of refugees during the Tampa crisis. Helen has worked at the University of Melbourne's Islamic Centre of Excellence in Islamic Studies and at the University of Sydney's Law Faculty, where her major research focus was on Muslim women in Australia. She has received several national and international awards, including an Order of Australia for the Human Rights, Refugee and Humanitarian work. Helen, it's an enormous pleasure and honour to welcome you to this podcast.
Oh, thank you very much, Sue. That was a very well-informed introduction. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gundungurra people up in the highlands, and their land was never ceded either. And so we acknowledge them. I acknowledge them today too.
Thanks, Helen. Well, let's get started. And I'd like to actually go back before October 7, because as I'm sure every listener knows, the conflict between Israel and Palestine has a very long history. And I want to focus on healthcare initially. We've all seen the absolutely horrifying images of the attacks on healthcare over the last 6 months, the destruction of hospitals, the attacks on ambulances, the killing of healthcare workers, arrests and torturing of healthcare workers, etc., etc. So we've got a pretty good idea, although only those living there would really know. But as far as we know, the situation is in absolute crisis and near total destruction. But I'd like to ask you, what was the healthcare situation in Gaza and perhaps Palestine more generally like before October 7? How well supplied was it? How was access for those who needed it? What impact did the siege of Gaza have on healthcare before October 7?
Since 2007, since the democratic election, which was supervised, at which Hamas actually won that democratic election, that was resisted generally by the outside world, and they were labelled as terrorists, and so nobody would deal with them, including, of course, Israel, put them under siege for the last 17 years. And during that time, there was also limited accessibility, but they could always get support and facilities and medical equipment, etc., through Egypt, whereas the situation's changed now where the Israelis are insisting on searching everything that's going into Gaza. So there were a lot of hospitals there, actually. There were 36 hospitals, of which 10 are functioning and hardly functioning at all because they don't have the necessary medicines, health supplies, doctors or fuel. So, they're only struggling. But prior to that, there was a European hospital, for instance. There was a hospital built by the Turks, another one by the Indonesians. And there was two huge hospitals, Nasser Al-Shifa Hospital, which had a bed capacity of 2,000 patients. So it was a huge facility, as was Nasser. So that was in the middle of Gaza, near Gaza City. And then there was Nasser Hospital down at Khan Yunis that supplied support to people in the south of Gaza. But they also had every specialist unit you can think of. They had dialysis, they had cardiac units, they had rehabilitation, they had cancer units. They had all of the facilities. Sometimes people had to leave Gaza, and there were people in Israel who would sometimes facilitate, with working with the Israeli government to get them out for very specialist sorts of treatments. But in general, I was quite surprised at the extent of health facilities available. But like I said, there were still limitations on it because on the northern border, the Eretz crossing, the Israelis controlled absolutely everything, and so things couldn't always get through that were needed. And actually after 2019, after the March of Return, when the Israeli snipers had bets with each other as to how many legs they could shoot. There were 800 or 900 young men who had surgery, and many of those lost their limbs. And as a consequence, they then had a very good rehabilitation and especially a prosthesis unit working. But of course, all of those things have been destroyed.
Helen, what would you say about Israel's responsibility as the occupying power to provide for the healthcare of the people of? It sounds as if most of the responsibility was fallen on other outside nations. What would you say about how well Israel was catering for the health of the people?
They were definitely not providing the assistance that they are obliged to as an occupying power. And as we know, what's happened for the last 6 months is that Palestinian doctors and nurses and health facilities are considered to be covered under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which has been shredded to pieces by this. But look, it's not the first time that Israel has done this or has facilitated other militia to do this. In 1982, they entered what was called Gaza Hospital, which was in Sabra Shatila, and the Lebanese militia, but with full oversight from the Israeli army, entered that hospital and killed patients. They took the nurses and doctors, Palestinians, down a side street and murdered them. And then they took the foreign nurses out, down the road to go out. And they were really, the foreigners were saved by the Israeli military, who was watching everything. And so they had a good view up on a hill. And so they came screaming down to save these foreigners. Otherwise, they knew that would be an even worse problem for them. But then the Lebanese forces crossed over the road where they were, and they entered the, maybe it was Al-Aqsa. Oh, I've got a small blank on the hospital. Anyway, they entered that hospital as well, and Olfat was working there along with other nurses and doctors. She and some of the others were fortunate to get away, but patients were killed. Doctors and nurses were also raped and killed during that time. So Israel has, and for a long time, in all of its wars, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, some 400 ambulances have been attacked in the West Bank. And I couldn't quite get the figure, but I do know that there have been a large number of ambulances that have been bombed and completely destroyed. And they were doing that in over the war in 1982. They didn't hesitate to bomb an ambulance back then. So they have trashed every UN law you can think of. Israel has trashed to pieces. But in particular, the Fourth Geneva Convention, because most countries actually do oblige by the Geneva Fourth Convention.
So this is a very long history, and I think most of us probably don't know the extent of that. We know a little, but not the true extent of it, as those living in it know. I just want to come back to you've obviously got to know Palestinian women very well over a long period of time. In the face of the brutality that's been going on for decades, what keeps these people going? Not just women, but particularly the women. They're the ones whom you've studied particularly closely. And do you see some hope for the future in their resilience?
Well, over the last 40 years of my time with Palestinians was a nationalist liberation movement. And so during the 1980s, the focus was definitely on liberation, but it was also to some extent on women's rights. And it was a liberation movement, and so they were committed to all of those things that most liberation movements are committed to. But as things have changed, particularly in the camps in Lebanon and in other places, as they have continued to lose hope, there's been a rise in religiosity. In other words, there's a lot more women wearing the hijab, and praying more religiously. And that was also very obvious. My first visit to Gaza would have been in 1986 or 87. And the image was very similar. There were a lot of women who were not wearing veils. And indeed, the first nurses who came out to Australia, there was only a couple of them who were veiled, who were wearing the hijab. But increasingly over time, you have seen a growth in people, of course, have turned to faith to find a space for themselves and to find courage, actually. And I'm sure you and other listeners would have seen, so many Muslim women who've lost families. They were saying even in their loss, this is God's will. I will learn to live with this because this is happening, and we have to accept it. So very strong sense of accepting, but also a strong sense of, fighting against the occupation that never went away. Yeah.
So the role of religion has perhaps been dual in that it gives the people some sense of unity and meaning, perhaps, but then on the other hand, might have had a repressive effect in addition.
Well, you're always hesitant to say that it has that, because certainly my reading and my studies of Islam doesn't come to that conclusion. And any of the women that I know, Olfat and a whole lot of other women who are very, very strong women, both in Palestine but here in Australia, do not feel oppressed at all, actually. That is not their lived experience. Their experience of, what they're suffering at the moment in Australia, particularly those that are wearing the hijab, is there's a terrible rise in Islamophobia that the, government quite correctly refers to anti-Semitism, but, in the same breath, they really ought to be talking about the abuse that Muslim women are facing and Muslims are facing in this country during this situation in Gaza. So I think the reason why I did my PhD was because there was this, thought in my mind, like most Western feminist women, these women have been suffering under their husbands' thumbs. And all the time that I lived there, that was never my experience. In fact, I found that the men were wonderful with their children and they were wonderful to their mothers and their wives. They had a great love for the role of women in the family. It just may not be the same role that we have, but it is a role which gives stability and love. And still women like Olfat, for instance, was able to go, she worked all the time, all her life, nearly right up to when she was having the babies, up until she delivered them, and then soon after. And then she studied and did her PhD eventually. So, I looked at her and I looked at other women that I met over there, and I thought, there's something more than this that's going on in the community. It just isn't quite as we as white feminists saw it before. So that was my personal lived experience.
Well, that's what counts, what's happening on the ground, isn't it? We might come back to some of that because I wanted to ask you more about some of those things. But let's talk about the situation in Australia a little now. And firstly, the role of the media here. And I wonder if you could comment, Helen, on your observations of how the mainstream media has performed, not just since October 7, but before October 7. And it was just to preface that with, I think we all know that mainstream media tend to focus almost exclusively on what's happening right now, often with very strong biases, but particularly interested in the long history of conflicts. So would you like to comment on mainstream media since and before October 7?
Well, I think despite all the really good efforts of the Palestinian support organisations and other people over the years, is the media do not seem to want to inform themselves of the historic facts or the context. And as a consequence, you'll get an emotive response to one issue which might be driven by international media as well, and not everybody's able to have their own people on the ground, and definitely haven't had people in Gaza itself. We've relied extensively on the very brave recordings and interviews by the Palestinian journalists and other media. So, to be perfectly frank, I've only ever watched ABC and SBS, and I've found that the SBS does provide some coverage, but quite often I find myself sitting down writing a letter or making a phone call saying, "What are you doing? You got that all wrong. Don't you know the facts about this?" And it's definitely the same with the ABC. Although, I have to say they've run a couple of very good programs recently, and I've got a lot of time for John Lyons. The Four Corners program that he did, and then the other foreign correspondent program somebody else did. Both of those were very good programs. But the truth of the matter is that I think the media that you and I have been used to all of our lives, young people just aren't watching it. They're getting all of their information from all the social media sites. And I think that that's been a very powerful way that they have been able to mobilise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across the world. Because if they had relied on the traditional media sources, you would never get the information. And in fact, myself, I'd do as much as possible watch Al Jazeera and read Al Jazeera because I feel that they've got a much better understanding under the historical context, and they've also got very good links right across the region. Because they've got experts across the region that they're able to draw on, that'll be able to contextualise what's going on.
So social media can be a powerful force for good in situations like this. I wanted to ask you also about the Australian government's responses to, and again, we could talk about before October 7 and since October 7, but let's talk for the moment about what the Australian government has done, hasn't done since October 7, and the timing of the Australian government's responses, and what more you believe the Australian government could and should be doing.
Well, I have got a great deal of admiration for Bill Hayden and Gareth Evans, because in the 80s and 90s, when they were in government, they had a very, very principled stand on the issue of Palestine. And then AFIDA, Union Aid Abroad AFIDA, has been working in the Middle East for 40 years. And we've always had, under both governments, if you like, Liberal and Labor, we've had really extensive development aid programs that have been very, very successful. Unfortunately, under this government, so I'm going to go back to the start of this government, under this government, due to the efforts of the Israelis to which they listened, unfortunately, people might remember what happened to the World Vision person who was accused of stealing millions. Well, millions didn't exist, and they spent years giving that information, providing that that this is just a trumped-up case. And AFIDA suffered something similar about maybe 10 years ago, when one of the journalists came back from an Israeli-funded tour and ran a front-page splash of Union Aid Abroad supporting terrorists. And so it took AFIDA about 6 years to get that whole thing back on track. But we and the government had a substantial millions of dollars of program with Australian non-government organisations who had, the critical part is having partners on the ground. So we have to look at what Penny Wong, our Foreign Minister, has done. First of all, initially, she reinstated the previous UNRWA funding, which was good. And then, of course, without evidence, and the evidence still has not been supplied by Israel, UNRWA funds were cut, and they were cut by countries all across the world until they realised the Israelis were lying. I don't know why it took them that long to realise that. And so aid to UNRWA was cut, but then it's been reinstated. But the big, large NGO programs, we're talking with Anglicare and Care Australia and Oxfam and Union Aid Abroad, the funds that the government were providing to those organisations has not yet been reinstated, which is very tragic because, like I said, we've had very, very close, warm relations with the Palestinians partners, and there are many of those partners for years and years. And they've been audited till they're to the end of the earth. They've been audited, and nothing has ever been produced at all. But the Israelis are quite determined to stop any support, and they particularly dislike non-government support because we've got a different base, and we're able to mobilise that base when we see human rights violations being continued. And unfortunately, under this government, I think they've been successful. So I think that that's a really big shame. And like I said, in the 80s and 90s, and, even under the Libs from time to time, they held a really good position on the Palestinian issue, that they stopped settlements and Palestinians have their rights to a homeland, etc. And even though that's been passed by the Labor Party, it's a policy of the Labor Party, they have not done anything about that at all. They should right now be recognising the state of Palestine.
And you would put that down primarily to strong lobbying from certain Jewish elements in the Australian society?
Not just Australian. I think the Israelis have an exceptionally effective propaganda machine, very, very strong. So quite a lot of it comes out of Israel. So the Jewish community in Australia doesn't have to make up anything, if you like. It's coming out of Israel. It's driven through Israeli organisations. And also, they take media and other key people in Australia across on fully paid, lovely holidays. And I know for a fact that Penny Wong went there, not the recent visit after October 7th, but it would have been a year or so ago, before they got into office, actually. She went and visited Israel, and she spent a day in the West Bank. That shows you where she's coming from. And I've never been quite able to understand it. And Julia Gillard was also very bad on the Palestinian issues, Some people have got very fixed opinions about the issue,
which does tend to reinforce what you were saying about lobbying coming from not just from elements within Australia, but much broader campaign to influence governments.
But I would like to make a quick point, actually, because just recently there's been a Jewish organisation set up called the Jewish Council of Australia. And a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks, they actually put out a press release calling on the government to cut all military ties to Israel and to place sanctions on Israel. It's a very strong statement. I've only just got bits and pieces of it, but if people were to go to their website, they would find those statements. And I think that they are definitely reflecting where a lot of Jewish people in Australia are moving to now, and realising that they do not want these war crimes and genocide being committed in their name, and it's against Judaism to be doing what the Israelis are doing. Yeah.
Yes, it's definitely a very encouraging development that we've noticed. Helen, just to come up to the immediate situation now, and we see that Israel has responded to some extent to President Biden's demands that more aid flow into Gaza, and Israel's indicated that there will be more border crossings opening up. Do you see this as an indication that there are some limits to US support for Israel, or do you see it as significantly window dressing to save face for the United States? How do you see that?
Well, I think under Biden, he's just he calls himself a Zionist. So I think that anything he does is being done for the home audience, because young people, Muslims and Arabs and young people across America have really mobilised. It's very, very heartening to see how they've mobilised, especially in these primaries, that, the election system cycle that they're going through at the moment. And I think that that's very encouraging, because, it says that they have a voice and they're powerful, and he's not the only one who can take positions on this issue. So, and I think the Labor Party in Australia needs to take heed as well, and they need to be changing their speech and what they're doing in relation to Gaza and the Middle East, because, clearly Muslim community and Arabs all across Australia, young people and people like us are saying, no, what's this? What's happening to the Labor Party? What's happening to the Labor Party? So there's a lot of distress and anger out there that I don't think the party's quite got a grip on, actually.
So your main message to the Australian people generally would be to try every means possible to get our voices heard, and to let the government know that more is needed. What would be the thing that you would most like the rest of us all of us to be doing right now?
Well, I think, the letter campaign and the campaign that Stuart Rees recently had up in Parliament House in Canberra, I think all of these things are really good. And we should be lobbying the government, because otherwise I think the government is in grave danger and very close to being complicit in a crime of genocide. And I think if we went down in history as this Labor government went down in history as a government supporting genocide in Palestine, I just think that would be the most shocking thing to happen. And what they need to do, and what we need to keep to pressuring everybody to do, through whichever organisation you're involved with, through the international non-government agencies, or through the churches, which I have to say have been very sadly extremely silent on this issue. The union movement is coming on board, again a little bit slowly, but the Nurses Federation in Victoria and New South Wales have both passed resolutions saying that that there should be sanctions put on Israel. And the ACTU Congress is coming up shortly, so anybody who's got any contact with the union movement should be pressuring their branches and their organisations to, really, because the ACTU have put out a couple of statements, and I think people are distressed about what's happening, but we want them to put that sort of emotion back on the government to say, you actually have to do something about this as well.
Right. I just mentioned also that very recently, a group of extremely senior, eminent paediatricians and child health experts in Australia have appealed to the government to do more to stop the war on children, because children are always the most vulnerable in war, and particularly in this war where children are born at a hugely disproportionate cost, to the extent that UN and other observers are saying. And I think yourself, you might have said, Helen, that this is a war on children. So very senior, eminent paediatricians have come out and appealed to the government to do far more, including stopping the export of military components and any form of military cooperation.
That's really wonderful. I'm glad that they've done that. I hadn't heard, but, I kept on thinking, why is the AMA, why are the medical professions been so quiet, especially when, there are people, Europeans and American doctors and health workers going there for a week or 2 weeks, and they're coming out with their stories, which are truly horrific. truly horrific.
Yes, I would agree with your reflection observation that the health professional organisations generally have not been strong voices in Australia, and that's been quite distressing for some of us. This is really a challenge. What's happening in Gaza is really a challenge to everything that we in health professions care for and believe in.
Absolutely.
So we're calling on other health professional organisations. You mentioned the AMA, and there are others. Some of the colleges have been really silent. Helen, there's so much more that we could be talking about, but we're going to have to wrap up. And I would like to just ask if you would have any, coming back to your dear friend, Dr. Mahmood, who's no longer with us. Would you like to share any reflections, perhaps that Dr. Mahmood might have shared with us, something that provides hope, something that restores our faith in humanity at this time, when it seems quite difficult at times to retain hope, but we must.
Olfat was also a woman of faith. Most people didn't know that because she didn't wear the hijab. They never saw that part of her. I know she would be calling on us, as the women do from Gaza, to stop this slaughter. She would be calling on all of us to do what we possibly could through any avenue at all to stop the slaughter, actually. And I know she would say, which is what the women in Gaza say, we're not leaving this land. This is our land. You're not going to push us out, and we're going to stay. And that Olfat spent a lot of time internationally doing peace talks. If anybody should have got the Jerusalem Prize, I felt I was getting it for her, because she did an enormous amount of work in actual peace discussions, with Arabs across the Middle East, and Israeli youth would come as well, and women. So she would say absolutely that we all have to keep on working for peace, and the Palestinians are not going anywhere, and we have to work at how they are going to live in harmony with the Israelis without these vicious crimes and attacks and murderous, barbaric actions to be just repeated over and over again. It's not possible to endure so much suffering. And I know she would be calling on all governments to definitely should be calling on sanctions, because we've known each other those 40 years. And so I was very involved in the sanctions against South Africa as well, and the anti-apartheid movement. And she would be saying, why isn't the world doing this for the Palestinians as well? So yes, she would definitely be calling for sanctions and for finding ways to develop peace, with finding opportunities and making opportunities where Palestinians and Israelis are going to be able to live together, because neither are going anywhere. And at some point in time, there has to be some solution that accommodates the desires and wishes and hopes of both peoples.
Thank you very much, Helen. And we'll finish on that note that there needs to be a way out of this. There are ways out of this, and we need to insist that our government does far more to try to find those ways to peace for all the people in the Middle East and beyond. So for all of us, this is a call to work through whatever means we have as individuals, as members of unions, churches, professional organisations, community groups, or whatever. We need to be urging our government and other governments to be doing far more to bring peace to the Palestinians and to the Israelis. Helen, it's been a great honour to have this conversation with you. You've been a real trailblazer for peace in the Middle East, and we sincerely thank you for what you've been doing and continue to do. And we will all take on this challenge. I think in the belief that what we all say and do matters very much as individuals and as members of communities. So thank you, Dr. Helen McHugh.
Thank you very much. It's been delightful speaking with you, Sue. Really delightful. Nice to see your face too. Thank you very much for doing a wonderful interview, and I hope I've also done it justice. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Helen.